All right, I'm sorry about that. I don't know that this will be any better, but if I lose you again, we'll just have to scrap it for tonight. I will have land-based internet on Wednesday night, so our Wednesday night study, um, unless the church building that I'm planning to borrow is having technical problems, then I should have a much better connection. Um, I knew that doing this remotely and while on the move was going to be a challenge. Like I said, I hoped to be nearer Knoxville, um, but it is what it is. So I apologize. Um, Not my brightest moment, I guess. Okay, let's jump into our study. By the way, it's good to see Tim and Cassie Coleman tonight. They have joined our study. We're glad to have them join us. I think everybody in our group knows them. Um, what we're going to do tonight, Tim and Cassie, we've continued working on our 17 Bible time periods, and we've been filling in details of those 17 Bible time periods. Um, so uh, don't feel we're not trying to run off and leave you or anything like that, but our folks have been through some of this already. Um, so let's do a little bit of review tonight, uh, and maybe that would be a good use of our time. Our first Bible time period is before the flood. That is everything before the flood of Noah's day. This is the first 5 chapters of the book of Genesis. So, if you were going to, for the sake of review for our people, um, what are the 5 bullet points or the 5 parts that go in before the flood? What do we include in this time period?
Creation of the world.
All right, the creation of the world.
Adam and Eve.
All right, Adam and Eve in the garden. Okay. What comes next?
First sin.
All right, the first sin.
Abel.
The story of Cain and Abel. And then after the death of Abel, the birth of who?
Seth.
Seth, okay. And then finally, one more.
Generations.
All right, generations. The generations transition us from the creation stories and uh, the 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 uh, the first stories of Adam and Eve and their children, and transition us through generations that get us from our first Bible time period before the flood to our next Bible time period, which is what?
Flood.
The flood.
The flood. All right, good. All right, so the next layer of this that we've started doing, and we'll take a little bit of time to review as we go along, are to talk about what chapters, at least where we can do it kind of neatly, what chapters go along with each of our major bullet points in each of our Bible time periods. So, what chapter of Genesis are we going to find the stories of creation? Or the
Chapter
story?
1.
All right, chapter 1. If we're going to read about Adam and Eve in the garden, where are we going?
2.
All right, good. All right, I was hoping that wasn't a trick question. All right, and then the story of the first sin. 3. Cain and Abel.
4.
4. And then the generations that transition us to the period of the flood.
5.
Chapter 5. Now, unfortunately, they're not all so neat and tidy as we have already discovered. But again, the idea is that we can get the big events, the key characters as we go along, a little at a time, and we know where to go, where we can go find those stories. And again, this is twofold. One, it's for the organization of Bible knowledge in our own minds, so that we know, so that we tie the story together, but also so that we can then relay the story to others. And when we're trying to recall a Bible story or an event or a person, perhaps to illustrate some particular truth that we're trying to communicate, we'll be able to put our hands on that. All right, so our second Bible time period is the flood. Broadly, this is chapter 6 through 10. All right, so let's talk about what goes into this time period. We start with the flood itself. That's pretty simple and straightforward. But then after the flood, after all of the events pertaining to the ark and the salvation of Noah and his family and the select number of animals from the flood, what else goes into this time period? After
Meat
the, all right, meat is given for food.
Law of capital punishment.
The law of capital punishment, the value of human life is emphasized there. What else?
rainbow.
The covenant of the rainbow. One more, and it plays particularly a role in the story of Israel and the territory that Israel will ultimately occupy.
Curse on.
The curse on Canaan. So you remember the story of Noah's drunkenness, and then it was Canaan who um, um, uh, or it was the forefather of Canaan, Ham, that saw the nakedness of his father, and therefore you have this generational curse. All right, and then you have more generations that fast forward. Each time you have this block of generations, what you're doing is you're fast forwarding through large chunks of time. And so, in the first, we've said this before, in the first 5 chapters of the book of Genesis, you have as much time passes in the first 5 chapters of the book of Genesis as in the rest of the Bible combined. And so the generations fast forward us from major periods of Bible history linking one to another. So you have the before the flood, and then you have generations, and you have the flood stories and another block of generations. All right, so let's assign chapters to this. We want to read about the flood itself, God warning about the flood, preparations for the flood, all of that. Where are we going to go? What chapters are we going to for the flood stories?
6 through 8.
Genesis chapter 6 through 8. All right. And so in chapter 6, God says, man's wickedness is exceedingly great. I'm going to punish man. The flood's coming. Noah, you need to prepare an ark. And then you have the preparations and then the flood itself. All right. The next 4 all come in Genesis chapter 9. All of these are bits and pieces that come immediately after the flood story. So the waters recede, the ark rests on the mountains of Ararat. Noah and his family come off the ark. There are sacrifices that are offered, and you have these other things that happen at that time. And then Genesis chapter 10. In Genesis chapter 10, you have another block of generations that connect the flood to our next Bible time period. All right. So, what is our next Bible time period after the flood?
Next Bible time period.
The scattering of the people. That's right. The scattering of the people. And all of this is found in Genesis chapter 11. So there's just the one Bible time period, or the one chapter rather, the story of the Tower of Babel, the dividing of the languages, and then have another smaller, but another set of generations that transition us from the scattering of the people to our next Bible time period, which is what?
The patriarchs.
All right, the patriarchs. Staff in the hand, they're wandering, they're sojourning in the land. So, the period of the patriarchs. The patriarchs, this Bible time period is the rest of the book of Genesis, 12 through the end of the book of Genesis. All right, so if we're going to fill in very broadly, but if we're going to fill in the period of the patriarchs, what are our bullet points that we're going to include?
Abraham,
Abraham, Isaac, Isaac, and then Jacob. That's right. That's right. I'm having trouble hearing everybody else, but I can hear Evelyn. All right. I didn't hear that last part, so don't worry, Diana. All right, so these are the three patriarchs through whom the story is traced. They're not the only characters, and we're not going to fill in all of the detailed events with each of them, but Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then the story narrows focus not really on a patriarch, but upon one of the sons of Jacob. And the book of Genesis closes focusing on the story of one particular son. And what story is that? The story of
Joseph.
the story of Joseph. That's right. All right. So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then the story of Joseph. All right, let's assign chapters in Genesis to this time period. If I want to read stories about Abraham, if I want to read about God making promises to Abraham, God's covenant with Abraham, in what chapters of the book of Genesis do I need to be looking?
Twelve through 25.
12 through 25. So, sort of an easy, well, again, you know how I like little memory devices when it comes to numbers. Obviously, it starts in 12. 12 is just one of those chapters that, quite frankly, you just need to have memorized because that's where the threefold promise to Abraham is introduced. Genesis chapter 12. That just needs to be one of those key chapters that is just burned into your memory. There are others like it, but that's one of those really important chapters, Genesis chapter 12. And then the way I remember 25 is, all right, well, we're going to 50, but we're not going all the way to 50. We're going halfway to 50. I realize my math is fuzzy, but halfway to 50, 25, you get where I'm going. So 12 to 25. Remember that when we talk about these patriarchs and talk about the chapters associated with them, we're not talking about the chapters, or we're not beginning with the chapters where they are born. Or when they're first introduced, but when they become the patriarch, when their name becomes the main character of the story. All right, we're following the Bible narrative, and so we learn about the birth of Abraham as the son of Nahor in Genesis chapter 11, but really the story of as Abram doesn't pick up till 12. Isaac is born while Abraham's still alive, but Isaac's not the patriarch. He's not the main character through whom the story is narrated until Abraham's gone. That doesn't happen until Genesis chapter 25 goes through chapter 28. The story of Jacob occupies 25 through 36, or 35 rather. We have a little bit of a parenthesis in Genesis chapter 36 where it's about Esau and the descendants of Esau. Esau is also known as what? By what other name? And particularly the nation that descended from Esau.
Edom?
Edom, that's right.
Edom?
That's right. Genesis chapter 36 and the story of Esau is inserted because we need to kind of know, well, what happened to Esau? Because when we're first introduced to Jacob and Esau, the twins that were born, you have the whole story of Jacob, holding on to his heel, and God saying regarding the twins, the older will serve the younger. And so you kind of got to get Esau's story caught up as we go along. And so periodically through Bible history, you're going to find information about Edom. It's just a little bit here and there, but that's included because this narrative, this this conflict between Jacob and Esau that's first introduced all the way back in Genesis. I can't remember the chapter. I have to go back and look at the specific chapter number. But with the birth of Jacob and Esau, that storyline is going to continue forward, even into the Old Testament prophets. We've talked about that some recently. And then Joseph's story becomes front and center in Genesis chapter 37. And everything pretty well revolves around Joseph from 37 forward, because it's Joseph's story that gets the family of Jacob and the sons of Jacob and their extended families that's going to move them from sojourning in the land of Canaan to where geographically? The story of Joseph moves them, but where does it move them to?
Did you say Egypt?
All right, Egypt. That's right. About 75 total members of that family end up in Egypt. And so that then brings us to our next Bible time period. So we've had before the flood, the scattering of the people, the patriarchs. At the end of Genesis chapter 50, the family of Jacob is in Egypt. Is that where they're going to stay? Is that where God is in the family of Jacob?
Yeah.
They leave, go to the Exodus.
All right, that leads us to the Exodus. That's right, because God needs to bring them out of Egypt and to the promised land. That's the Abrahamic promise. All right, so when we talk about the period of the Exodus, we're talking about the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and the first 13 chapters of Numbers. We'll talk about all of that here in just a second. All right. Everybody with me so far, at least as much as you can hear and understand through less than ideal circumstances? All right. I'm going to take your silence as a yes, or you are tuned out. I got one thumbs up. Okay, good. All right. All right, so let's fill in some details of the Exodus. Where do we start? If we're going to tell the story of the Exodus, where do we start?
Israel in bondage.
All right, Israel's in bondage in Egypt. Now, when the family moved there in the days of Joseph, they didn't start out in bondage, but as they grew and became this large mass of people, subsequent Egyptian leadership said, we got to do something about these people, and so we're going to oppress them. We're going to make them slaves. So we start out with Israel in bondage. But now we need to get Israel out of bondage. So how does that story progress? A major character comes onto the scene. Who is that?
Moses.
Moses. All right, so that's the next big piece of that. Moses is born to the nation of Israel, but he's in a unique position because he wasn't raised strictly as a Hebrew. Instead, he was raised how?
The son of Pharaoh's daughter.
As the son of Pharaoh's daughter. When he was about 40 years old, we learned this from Acts chapter 7. When he was about 40 years old, Moses got the idea that, you know what, I'm in a position of power because I've been raised in the royal court of Pharaoh, but I'm a Hebrew. And so I can accomplish deliverance for my people. And so you have a couple of stories. One, where he saw a fellow Hebrew being mistreated by an Egyptian, and in rescuing him from the Egyptian's hand, he killed the Egyptian, buried the body in the sand. And then the next day, he sees two Israelites fighting with each other, and he attempts to mediate the dispute. And they say, "Oh, are you going to kill one of us like you killed the Egyptian?" Moses knows then that his crime is known, and so Moses is rejected by his people, rejected by the Hebrews. They're not ready for him to be their deliverer. And so what happens next?
He flees to Midian.
That's right. He fled to the wilderness of Midian. He fled to the wilderness of Midian. That's where he met and married his wife. And that's where he spent the second 40 years of his life. So the first 40 years he spent in Egypt. The next 40 years he spends in Midian. And so Acts chapter 7 says that he was trained in all the learning and education of the Egyptians. He was a man mighty in words and deed. The idea is that Moses was probably a little mightier than he thought he was. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. That he wasn't as mighty as he thought he was. That he was a little bit too big for his britches and thought, all right, I'm going to rescue my people. God has to humble him for 40 years as a shepherd in the wilderness of Midian. But then something really big happens after 40 years in Midian. What happens next in the story?
Burning bush.
Burning bush.
You have the scene of the burning bush, where God says, okay, Moses, 40 years in Midian's long enough, back to Egypt. Moses protests a bit, but God ultimately sends him back to Egypt to be the deliverer for his people that he intended to be, that he wanted to be 40 years earlier. All right. So now Moses is going to accomplish, is going to be the human agent through whom God is going to accomplish deliverance of his people. Is Pharaoh ready just to let the Israelites go at Moses' word?
No.
No. So what comes next in the story?
Plagues.
The
The
plagues.
plagues.
The plagues come next. And so you have Moses and Aaron performing signs, trying to persuade Pharaoh. Pharaoh's not being persuaded. And so God says, okay, I'm going to bring about plagues, and I'm going to humble the Egyptians to the point that they are going not just let the people of Israel go, but they are going to drive them out. They are going to be ready to get the Israelites out of the land of Egypt. And so ultimately, what's the final plague?
Killing of the firstborn.
All right, the death of the firstborn. And so ultimately, the Egyptians drive the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. But they barely left Egypt. Pharaoh changes his mind, as he was prone to do. They catch up to Israel at the Red Sea. And then you have this very dramatic deliverance of the Lord, as if it hadn't been dramatic enough, where the Lord rescues Israel and destroys the Egyptian army in the process. And so you have the crossing of the Red Sea. After the crossing of the Red Sea, where are they headed? What's the next big stop in the story?
Mount Sinai.
Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is the next big stop in the story. And so after the crossing of the Red Sea, you have their trip to Mount Sinai and then the events at Mount Sinai. We separate that because there are some important things that happen on the way to Sinai. For example, you have some early things regarding Sabbath observance. You have one of the early occasions where they doubted and tested the Lord regarding the bitter waters made sweet. You have a couple of those things that happen along the way between the Red Sea and Mount Sinai. Those are important events, so we separate those. And then you get to Mount Sinai, and it's difficult to separate all of that out, but you have all of the events at Mount Sinai. You have God descending on the mountain, you have the 10 commandments given, you have the rest of the law, all the preparations for the tabernacle, the construction of the tabernacle, the preparations for the priesthood. All of that happens at Mount Sinai. About how long were they at Mount Sinai?
A year?
About a year. That's right, about a year. Just under a year. All right, after everything at Mount Sinai, they head out. Where are they going next? What's the next big stop?
Kadesh.
Canaan?
Kadesh.
Oh, yeah.
Kadesh, or and it's sometimes called Kadesh Barnea. That is to distinguish it from other places called Kadesh. Kadesh of Barnea, or the region of Barnea. Kadesh. And from Kadesh, what happened? Why is Kadesh important?
Spies were sent to the Canaan.
Right. From Kadesh, spies were sent into the land of Canaan, and you had 12 spies, one from each tribe, that were sent into the land. Two of the spies, Caleb and Joshua, came back and said, the land is absolutely everything God said it would be. By all means, let us go up and take it. The Lord God is with us. What did the other 10 spies say?
They couldn't do it.
Can't do it. The people are too mighty. The cities are too fortified. They're giants. There's just absolutely no way we can do it. And so, to whom did the children of Israel listen?
10 spies.
To the 10, and that consequently they refused to enter the land. All right, let's put some chapters with this. We want to read about Israel in bondage, kind of the opening scene, setting the stage for this Bible time period. Where are we going to read about that?
Chapter 1.
All right, Exodus chapter 1. We're going to read about it in Exodus chapter 1. We're going to read about the birth of Moses. Where are we going to read about that? We're going to read about that in chapter 2. And really, all of Moses' early life is in chapter 2. Reared as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, and his attempts to bring about deliverance, and then as a consequence, his flight to the wilderness. All of those early stories of Moses, again, that first 40 years of Moses' life, we read about in Exodus chapter 2. Where do we read about the burning bush and Moses' conversation with the Lord? I'll give you a hint. In this case, it's sequential. Exodus
3?
3 and 4. So you have this conversation in Exodus. God appears to him in the burning bush at the beginning of chapter 3. And you remember, of course, Moses made excuses. There's some back and forth with God. And so that story continues from chapter 3 over into chapter 4. When we talk about the plagues, for the sake of continuity, I pick them up in chapter 5. Now, the plagues don't really start in chapter 5, but the stage is being set because that's when Moses and Aaron first encounter Pharaoh, insisting that the people of Israel be let go. And so I put I start the plagues all the way in chapter 5, even though the plagues, technically the 10 plagues themselves don't start in chapter 5. But the plagues carry us all the way through chapter 13, the death of the firstborn, and as a consequence of that, Israel being driven out of the land of Egypt. The Red crossing is in chapter 14, and I include chapter 15 because the first part of chapter 15 includes the Song of Moses, the celebratory song of God's deliverance. And so I include 15 with the crossing of the Red Sea. The trip to Sinai picks up in 15 and goes through 18. And again, that includes some of the early matters regarding the Sabbath and some of the conflict as the people grumbled about the journey and shall we say the accommodations of the journey. So, if we're going to read about the events at Mount Sinai, we're going to pick up with Exodus chapter 19. How far do we read? The events at Mount Sinai begin in Exodus 19, go through Exodus chapter 40. But this also includes the book of Leviticus, that is God's laws regarding the priesthood and holiness and sacrifices, all of that, and uh, uh, and the first 9 chapters of the book of Numbers. And so here's how that works. Exodus 19 is the narrative, or Exodus rather, starting in chapter 19, is the narrative. It's telling us the story of everything that happened at Mount Sinai. Leviticus is filling in details, giving us more details of the law that aren't included in the narrative. Some of the laws included in the narrative, but Leviticus is giving us more of that detail. Numbers then is transitioning us, or the first 9 chapters of Numbers is transitioning us for them getting ready to leave Mount Sinai. All right, so that's how those scripture references work together. Does that make sense to everybody? Exodus is the narrative, Leviticus is the law, Numbers is the transition. All right, so that then means we've got to get from Sinai to Kadesh. That's Numbers chapters 10 through 12. And then again, some really important key chapters. The spies are sent into the land in chapter 13, and Israel refuses to go in chapter 14. Those are important chapters to remember in the story, because how is it that we go from God saying, yes, I'm going to rescue you out of it, I'm going to give you the promised land, to, oh, well, it's going to be 40 years. What's the key? What's the link in that chain? What's the connection in that story? Well, it's the story of Numbers chapters 13 and 14, where the spies bring back the bad report, the people believe them, and they say, no, we're not going to enter, and rebel against the Lord. All right? And so that then brings us to our next Bible time period, which is what?
Wandering
in the
with
wilderness.
All right, I only have one hand I can use right now, but wandering in the wilderness. All right. All right, I'm going to cut this one short. We still have a few minutes left technically since we restarted the clock, but it is 6:40, and that's what people are planning on. And I know the connection's not the best, and this one may take a little bit longer than the time I have left anyway. So I'm just going to go ahead and stop for tonight. I apologize. I'm sorry. I thought that this would work more smoothly than it has, and so I really appreciate your patience. I really had hoped that we would be further down the road and we could actually stop and hopefully have a more consistent signal. So I'm sorry. I've learned the hard way. I promise I'll never do this again. Um, in that vein, I'd love to have uh, those that when I am going to be gone, um, going to happen at some point, that we have someone who is willing to take over the responsibilities of making sure this goes off. It's not difficult. It's simple, straightforward. I'll be glad to walk you through it, but I'd just like to make sure that we have some consistency to it. So, y'all give that some thought, and love to have your help with that. All right, I'm going to sign off. Thank you all very much. Again, I appreciate your patience tonight, and thank you for joining us. You all have Laura is waving from the driver's seat. You all have a great week. Thank you, everyone. And Lord willing, I'll see you on Zoom on Wednesday night. And I will have Lord willing, knock on wood, all that good stuff. I will have a land-based internet connection, and so it should not be as painful on Wednesday night. Thank you all so much. Have a great week. Good night, everybody.
Safe
Safe
travel.
Bye.